You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
What does Sputnik have to do with student loans? How did a set of trembling hands end the Soviet Union? How did inflation kill moon bases? And how did a former president decide to run for a second non-consecutive term? These are among the topics we deal with on the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics podcast. We tell stories of history that relate to today's news events. Give a listen. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, wherever you get podcasts.
Near Gettysburg, we captured the camp and equipage of a force of Pennsylvania militia, and after an exciting chase of several miles, our regiment succeeded in picking up over 300 of the bandbox boys, as we called them. But few shots were fired on either side, but the yelling on our side would have done credit to a band of Comanche Indians. The main body of the fleeing enemy kept together in the highway, but many, as they became exhausted, sought refuge in the fields, orchards, and farm buildings by the way, and many laughable incidents occurred as we gathered them in. 6 were found hid among the branches of a large apple tree. One portly lieutenant, in attempting to crawl under a corn crib, had stuck fast by the head and shoulders, leaving the rest of his person exposed. Comrades Charlie Hyson and Morgan Feather had hard work to drag him out by the heels. But the most fun came when we dragged from a family bake oven a regimental officer who, in his gold-laced uniform, was covered with soot and ashes. He was a sight to behold. Sergeant James H. Hodum, 17th Virginia Cavalry, Jenkins Brigade, Ewell's Corps.
We were having our regular literary exercises on Friday afternoon when the cry reached our ears. Rushing to the door and standing on the front portico, we beheld in the direction of the theological seminary a dark, dense mass moving toward town. Our teacher, Mrs. Eyster, at once said, "Children, run home as quickly as you can." It did not require repeating. I am satisfied some of the girls did not reach their homes before the rebels were in the streets. As for myself, I had scarcely reached the front door when, on looking up the street, I saw some of the men on horseback. I scrambled in, slammed shut the door, and hastening to the sitting room, peeped out between the shutters. What a horrible sight! There they were, riding wildly, pell-mell down the hill toward our home, shouting, yelling most unearthly, cursing, brandishing their revolvers, and firing right and left. I was fully persuaded that the rebels had actually come at last. What they would do with us was a fearful question to my young mind. Tilly Pierce, resident of Gettysburg.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 311 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Thanks for tuning in to the podcast.
As you guys will recall, in the last show, we talked about the Confederates foraging and pillaging their way up the Cumberland Valley after they'd entered Pennsylvania. We said that Robert E. Lee had issued General Orders No. 72 for the dual purpose of 1. Prohibiting damage or destruction of private property, and 2. Authorizing only certain officers to seize it. We pointed out that these orders were designed to facilitate the efficient collection of supplies for the entire Army's benefit.
However, we also said that Robert E. Lee's orders warning his men to be on their good behavior and act as if they were invited guests in an enemy's country, well, that was demanding the impossible. And while marching through Pennsylvania, this land of plenty, many, if not most, Confederate soldiers paid little heed to Lee's instructions. One rebel admitted, quote, "The officers in command issued stringent orders with reference to private property, but the soldiers paid no more attention to them than they would the cries of a screech owl."
Private Joseph Pulley of the 4th Texas recalled awakening one morning after a night of foraging north of Chambersburg. He wrote, "Every square foot of an acre of ground not occupied by a sleeping or standing soldier was covered with choice food for the hungry. Chickens, turkeys, ducks, and geese squawked, gobbled, quacked, cackled, and hissed in harmonious unison as deft and energetic hands seized them for slaughter, and scarcely waiting for them to die, sent their feathers flying in all directions, and scattered around in bewildering confusion and gratifying profusion appeared immense loaves of bread and chunks of beef, hams and sides of bacon, cheeses, crocks of apple butter, jelly, jam, pickles, and preserves, bowls of yellow butter, jugs of buttermilk, and other eatables too numerous to mention. The scene was utterly indescribable."
Such was the unauthorized pillaging, but one aspect of the authorized foraging that we only mentioned in passing last week as part of Lee's orders, but that we wanted to elaborate on a bit in this episode, was the matter of the Confederates making requisitions in nearly every sizable town they entered in Pennsylvania.
At York, for example, which surrendered to Jubal Early's men on June 27th, Old Jube demanded nearly 30,000 pounds of baked bread, 32,000 pounds of beef, 2,000 pairs of shoes, and $100,000 in cash. As in most other towns that such demands were made, the people of York couldn't meet all of them. However, satisfied that they had at least made an effort, Early accepted the $28,000 that had been quickly raised.
That same day, Dick Ewell presented a similar list of demands to the people of Carlisle, though he was only looking for 23,000 pounds of bacon, 100 sacks of salt, 1,500 barrels of flour, and 3,000 pounds each of coffee and sugar.
If these sometimes outrageous demands for shoes, flour, and other such goods weren't met, as was true of Ewell's list of demands in Carlisle, the Confederates simply took what they could gather, searching through homes and businesses. Nonetheless, all things considered, there was very little malicious destruction of property by the invading army. One rebel officer later remarked, quote, "There was, in short, a good deal of lawlessness, but not so much as might have been expected under the circumstances."
However, none of that made the widespread Confederate foraging and pillaging any easier a pill for the Pennsylvanians to swallow. Ewell himself admitted, quote, "The people look as sour as vinegar, and I have no doubt would gladly send us all to kingdom come if they could."
With A.P. Hill's and James Longstreet's corps coming up the Cumberland Valley behind them, it was time for Dick Ewell's command to push on deeper into Pennsylvania. Pressing on, still as the spearhead of Lee's invasion, Ewell's further advance was planned along two different routes.
From Chambersburg, two of Ewell's divisions, those of Robert Rhodes and Allegheny Johnson, would go on following the northeastward and increasingly easterly curve of the Cumberland Valley. That meant Rhodes and Johnson would be continuing the great right-turning arc that we've been talking about.
That movement would take them from Chambersburg to Shippensburg, then through Carlisle, and on to the Susquehanna River, on the far bank of which stood Harrisburg, the Pennsylvania state capital. Ewell himself would travel with this column. And just as a side note, but we've already mentioned the town of Chambersburg quite a few times, and will continue to do so, and that's because, as Stephen Sears points out in his book on Gettysburg, quote, by its location, Chambersburg served as a strategic keynote in Robert E. Lee's invasion scheme. At the heart of the Cumberland Valley, 15 miles north of the Maryland border, sheltered from federal forces by South Mountain to the east, Chambersburg became the jumping-off point for the continued advance of Ewell's corps and the rendezvous point for Longstreet's corps and Hill's.
As Rhodes and Johnson went on from Chambersburg, Dick Ewell's 3rd Division, led by fierce and cantankerous Jubal Early, was sent off in a different direction. You see, while the other 2 divisions had followed the main road up the Cumberland Valley to Chambersburg, Early's men had marched nearby, but along the western base of the South Mountain Range, that is, on the eastern fringe of the valley.
Early's march took him to the crossroads town of Greenwood, where the turnpike leading from Chambersburg continued southeastward, crossed South Mountain at Cashtown Gap, and went on to Gettysburg. While his men enjoyed the bounty of the countryside around Greenwood, Old Jube rode on up to Chambersburg to meet with Ewell.
After consulting with Ewell, Early changed the direction of his march. He would take the turnpike and head southeast over South Mountain and then down the eastern slope to enjoy the equally great bounty of Adams and York counties.
His orders were to proceed through the towns of Gettysburg and York, all the way to the Susquehanna River at Wrightsville, downstream from where Rhodes and Johnson would strike the river. After Jubal Early captured the bridge at Wrightsville, he could either burn it or use it to cross the river. But in either case, it was expected that Old Jube would ultimately rejoin Ewell somewhere near Harrisburg.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely? That's what I'd like to call redacted history. I believe that all history, no matter how good or bad, needs to be told. There are wars, massacres, battles, and entire historical events that are just not in our school's history books. Have you ever heard of Mary Bowser? I didn't think so. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. So come huddle around the campfire with me and get ready to hear the stories that you were robbed of. And get comfortable. We're going to be here a while. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
Did archaeologists discover Noah's Ark?
Is the rapture coming as soon as the Euphrates River dries up?
Does the Bible condemn abortion?
Don't you wish you had a trustworthy academic resource to help make sense of all of this?
Well, I'm Dan Beecher, and he's award-winning Bible scholar and TikTok sensation Dr. Dan McClellan, and we want to invite you to the Data Over Dogma podcast,
where our mission is to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and also to combat the spread of misinformation about the same.
But, in a fun way.
Every week we tackle fascinating topics, we go back to source materials in their original languages,
and we interview top scholars in the field.
So whether you're a devout believer,
or you're just interested in a clear-eyed, deeply informed look at one of the most influential books of all time,
we think you're going to love the Data Over Dogma podcast,
wherever you subscribe to awesome shows.
Early's division struck out eastward over South Mountain at Cashtown Gap on the morning of a rainy June 26th. On his way over the mountain, Early stopped long enough to put to the torch all the buildings of the Caledonia Iron Works, an enterprise owned by U.S. Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, a famous radical Republican.
The abolitionist Stevens' outspoken advocacy of a vigorous prosecution of the war was well known to Early, and, in direct contradiction of Lee's instructions clearly spelled out in General Orders No. 72, well, old Jube decided to exact a little Southern justice of his own.
He ordered the ironworks burned and the supplies stored there seized, then turned a blind eye to his troops' vandalism of the workers' housing.
The rebel general believed that these actions were more than justified. In part, they were simple retaliation for, in Early's words, the, quote, various deeds of barbarity perpetuated by federal troops in some of the southern states.
But Early also admitted the destruction of the ironworks was meant to send a very personal message to Congressman Stevens for his, quote, most vindictive spirit toward the people of the South.
But, true to form, when he learned of the ironworks' destruction, Stevens would, tongue-in-cheek, commend the rebels on doing such a thorough job of cleaning him out. In any case, once through the pass, Early learned that a Yankee force of unknown composition was holding a position west of Gettysburg. He decided to flank the Federals by sending 3 of his brigades on a northerly swing through Mummisburg, while ordering the remaining one, John Gordon's, plus Elijah White's cavalry, to push straight ahead and develop the enemy's strength, location, and intentions.
In the next episode, with Ewell's approach on Harrisburg, we'll have more to say about Pennsylvania's and Washington's response to the Confederate invasion. But for now, we'll just point out that the unknown Yankee force blocking Jubal Early's path to Gettysburg was the 26th Pennsylvania Emergency Regiment. The 26th was a green militia outfit just recently raised in response to the unfolding crisis.
Actually, Company A of the 26th Pennsylvania Emergency Regiment was made up of men from Gettysburg who had responded to the recent call for volunteers to defend the Keystone State. After mustering in at Harrisburg, the men of Company A were back home. Well, they were a stone's throw from home, deployed with the rest of the regiment behind Marsh Creek, out the Chambersburg Pike, about 3 miles west of Gettysburg.
The 26th commander, Colonel William Jennings, hadn't agreed with the order sending his rookie militiamen out to Marsh Creek to confront the Confederates that were reported to be advancing upon Gettysburg. In fact, Jennings soon became convinced that the trouble heading his way was more than his eager but almost entirely untrained troops could handle.
One of the emergency soldiers later tried to put the best spin possible on the situation by suggesting, quote, "It has always seemed to me that the situation had in it much of the heroic. Untrained, untried, and unused to war, they were sent to meet an overwhelming and disciplined force, not in some Grecian pass, but in the open field, with the certainty that they could make no effectual resistance. These young men, in their unsoiled uniforms and flushed with enthusiasm, were to be thrown as a preliminary sacrifice to the Army of Northern Virginia."
Less dramatically, but more matter-of-factly, another militiaman remembered, quote, "Our colonel, left to his own resources, wisely decided to make an effort to return to Harrisburg and immediately struck off from the pike."
While he set off northeast, cross-country and along back roads in an effort to save his command, Jennings left behind a picked squad to serve as a rear guard, bolstered by a mounted detachment of home guardsmen. It was this delaying force that Elijah White's battalion of Virginia cavalry, nicknamed the Comanches, encountered at around 2 p.m. as they rode ahead of John Gordon's Georgia infantry.
It was no contest. White's howling Comanches advanced upon the enemy, and the thin screen of the terrified Federal rear guard threw down their weapons and begged for quarter or took to their heels. Without a shot being fired, the rebel horsemen had captured nearly 36 Yankees and cleared the way for Gordon's Confederate infantry to proceed toward Gettysburg without further delay.
Colonel Jennings lost most of the rest of his regiment at a skirmish not far away at the Whitmer farm. As he had tried to hustle the men along, the tremendous pace and emotional strain, coupled with the miserable condition of the country roads, caused a fearful amount of straggling.
Finally, after slogging to a point about 4 miles northeast of Gettysburg, Jennings called a halt about 4 p.m. near the Henry Whitmer farmhouse. The pursuing rebel cavalry caught up to the bedraggled column of militiamen shortly thereafter.
Jennings' attempts to pull together a coherent defense with his painfully inexperienced troops were undone by fear and confusion as much as by Confederate gunfire. In the end, Jennings escaped with only about 120 men out of the 740 with whom he'd started the day. He led what was left of the 26th Pennsylvania Emergency Regiment back to Harrisburg, while the Confederate horsemen busied themselves rounding up prisoners. One of those rebels was Sergeant James Hodum of the 17th Virginia Cavalry, from my first-person account at the very top of the episode. Here, after escorting a few of the captured Yankees to the rear, Hodum came upon some other prisoners being hurried along, quote, while a short distance behind them a little drummer boy was trying to keep up. He was bareheaded, wet, and muddy, but still retained his drum. "Hello, my little Yank. Where are you going?" I said.
"Oh, I am a prisoner and am going to Richmond," he replied.
"Look here," I said. "You are too little to be a prisoner, so pitch the drum into that fence corner, throw off your coat, get behind those bushes, and go home as fast as you can."
"Mister, don't you want me for a prisoner?"
"No."
"Can I go where I please?"
"Yes."
"Then you bet I am going home to Mother."
Hodum concluded his story. Saying this as he threw his drum one way and his coat another, he disappeared behind a fence and some bushes, and I sincerely hope he reached home and Mother.
Once they'd ridden over and through the ineffective Yankee rear guard at Marsh Creek, White's Comanches had continued along the Chambersburg pike toward Gettysburg. Deciding that shock tactics would suppress any further opposition, they charged into town yelling and firing their pistols in the air.
Professor Michael Jacobs, who taught at Gettysburg's Pennsylvania College, remembered that the Virginians galloped into town at 3:15 that afternoon, quote, shouting and yelling like so many savages from the wilds of the Rocky Mountains, firing their pistols, not caring whether they killed or maimed man, woman, or child.
However, a few of the younger residents took it less seriously. In the house where Gates Fainstock lived, the, quote, boys looking through the slatted shutters from the second story saw and enjoyed it as they would a Wild West show.
Well, the Wild West show turned deadly when some of White's Comanches flushed out a couple of the Federal Home Guard cavalry pickets who had been left behind when the rest of the squadron rode off to Marsh Creek. 2 of these Yankees tried to escape, but one was thrown off when his horse refused to jump a fence. When he confronted his pursuers with pistol in hand, he was gunned down. On June 26, 1863, Private George Sandow thus earned the unhappy distinction of being the first federal soldier to die in combat at Gettysburg. Sandow was a 20-year-old farmer from there in Adams County and had been married to his wife, Anna, for just 4 months when he was killed in that field not far outside of town.
Meanwhile, in Gettysburg, for a while the rebel cavalry had free rein in everything. A woman recalled them, quote, ransacking the barns, stores, and chicken coops, end quote. Things became a bit more orderly after John Gordon's Georgia infantry marched into town. Henry Jacobs, the professor's son, recalled that, quote, these Confederates were very formal and businesslike in their attitude toward the townspeople.
Not long after Gordon's troops secured the town, Jubal Early rode in from Mummasburg, where he'd halted the rest of his division. The disheveled and dejected survivors of the 26th Pennsylvania Emergency Regiment were gathered in the town square, where old Jube lectured them on the folly of going off so ill-prepared to war. Before paroling them, Early told them, "You boys ought to be home with your mothers, and not out in the fields where it is dangerous and you might get hurt."
Early, of course, provided the town authorities with a list of foodstuffs and supplies he expected to be produced and turned over to his command. But if they weren't available, he said he'd take $5,000 in cash instead. In a somewhat cheeky response, Gettysburg's Borough Council President, David Kindlehart, declared that neither food nor cash would be forthcoming, though the town merchants would open their doors, quote, to furnish whatever they can of such provisions.
Early, however, had a timetable to keep. He had to have his men on the road to York first thing the next morning. And perhaps his habitual irritability had been quenched somewhat by burning Thaddeus Stevens' ironworks earlier in the day. And so, surprisingly, rather than losing his temper, old Jube sent squads off in a half-hearted search of the town that managed to turn up a couple of thousand military rations intended for the militia at the railway station. After seeing that Gordon's men got the food, Early rode off to his headquarters to plan the next day's march.
Among the rebel units spending the night in Gettysburg before marching on to York was the band attached to Gordon's brigade. A 15-year-old resident of the town, Albertus McCreary, would never forget how, quote, unquote, exasperating it had been to hear those musicians, quote, through the night playing Dixie and other Confederate tunes.
June 26th had certainly been a day to remember for the residents of Gettysburg. Many of them believed that now that they had been visited by the war firsthand, the rest of the fighting would surely pass them by. Little did they know that within 1 week, the war would be returning to their town, and when it came back, it would do so with a vengeance.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is Flames Beyond Gettysburg, The Confederate Expedition to the Susquehanna River, June 1863, by Scott L. Mingus Sr.
Don't forget you can find all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
We wanted to let you know that just yesterday we released Members Episode number 101, which was the 5th show in our series on Jeb Stuart's controversial ride to Gettysburg.
We want to thank the newest members of the Strawfoot Brigade, who are Peter, Philip, Ed, and James,
Wayne, Robert, Doug, and Alex.
And thanks to Anne, and also to Steinar for their donations this past week.
Thanks, y'all.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a history podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you'll join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.